welcome to the 72nd episode of the Wormhole podcast, bringing on an author and talking with them in detail about one, occasionally more, of their books. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is the author of a pretty epic novel of the lives of a few of the people in a touring circus during the Second World War. Called The Circus Train, it was published last year. Hello, Amita Parikh.
Hi, Charlie. How are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm great.
So we'll get straight into it. So on the circus train are Lena and her father, Theo, from Greece. Lena's mother died just after her birth, and Lena contracted polio. She uses a wheelchair and has always felt different and apart from the other children in the circus. Theo is an illusionist, a star wherever he travels. He's kept a secret for Lena's mother all these years. That's a bit I really like, actually. And then there's Alexander, who boards the train in a stowaway fashion. He's a Jew from France, and it's the 1940s. You've also got lots of other characters too. One in the foreground is Horace, the circus producer who is always looking for more magnificence and originality. We focus most often on Lena. Most people run away to the circus, but Lena wants to run from it, which is obviously a whole thing going on there. And Amita, I'm going to have to start with the characters, I think. That's where we better start. Can you tell us about the inspiration? Let's start with Lena.
Okay, Lena. So a question I get a lot actually from a lot of people is, are the characters based on real people? And they're not. They're really just figments of my imagination. What I will say, though, is that bits and pieces of really my entire life are woven into characters throughout. So for Lena, for example, I have spent a lot of my life volunteering and working with children and adults with disabilities. And so I really wanted to explore that a little bit further in a fictional setting, but also have that contrast of having somebody who feels like they don't necessarily belong at a circus, which, to be honest, is made up of people who feel like they don't belong. So you would think that that would make them feel at home, to your point. And yet for Lena, she feels the opposite, right? She wants to run away from it, at least at the beginning. So that's a little bit about her. And then in terms of her character, I've always loved science and medicine. And so I wanted to write about a female at a different time period when it just wasn't traditional for them to be interested in pursuing education. I was like, what if I give her that passion, and then she has all these roadblocks to, following her pure joy? I wanted to see what that would be like. In terms of like her temperament and things, I read a lot about strong female characters. I read a lot of books with strong female characters these days. I think it's a very popular thing to do, and deservedly so. What I often don't see are female characters who don't necessarily have to be outwardly aggressive. Lena is actually a very quiet, even-tempered person. She doesn't necessarily want the attention. She has a very quiet confidence and calmness about her, which I love. And I think, me growing up as a shy person and a self-proclaimed introvert, it's often hard for me to relate to extroverts and people who are, kind of very loud and out there and shouting and things. So I wanted to bring that into her character as well. And then Theo, I've always loved magic. And so I wanted to create a story with a magician. And then Alexandra was sort of the foil to all of that, right? Him arriving to the circus creates a source of conflict and a little bit of feeling of like doom. So I wanted to weave all those things together and see where it would take me.
That's interesting. I mean, one thing I did wonder, just as a kind of what if, I suppose, was how the story might have been if Theo hadn't been an illusionist and he had been some other sort of magician. I don't know, a flamethrower or a juggler or something. That would have changed the story a lot, I suppose.
I think so, because I think the theme of illusion and deception is woven throughout in so many different parts of the novel, right? There are the secrets that certain people keep, which I won't give away anything. And then there's also the whole aspect of the Second World War and the secrets and things that people kept because it was a very challenging, horrific time for many. So I think, yes, if Theo had been anything other than an illusionist or magician, it would have changed the story a lot.
We moved to the circus as a whole. So can I ask why a circus in general? Obviously, you've touched on Theo there. And I know that you used to be into figure skating and things. And how does this all relate?
Yeah, so again, that is a little bit of a passion of mine, a longstanding passion of mine. Performing, theatrical arts. I did a lot of dance and figure skating growing up. I went to performing arts high school. And so I was very immersed in this world of theater. But I didn't necessarily want to be the one who was on the stage performing, but I loved things like lighting and how that could change the feeling of a show. I loved things like costumes, the materials, and I really brought a lot of that in to the novel in the details. And so, again, it was just an aspect of something I loved in my childhood and as a teenager that I wanted to explore a little bit more.
Well, you said about the dancing, and I'm going to try and pronounce this properly. There is a snippet about Le Bayadère.
La Bayadère, yes.
La Bayadère.
Yes.
And I picked up on that as potentially being important. Just seemed
Wow.
something about it. And it's in your 10 fun facts blog post about your book. I'll put the link here. Can you tell us about your dancing experience in this context of ballet, etc.?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I'm not very good. I will say that right off the bat. I came to it a little bit later than a lot of people. I think I didn't start ballet until I was about 11 or 12, to be honest. But I had been figure skating since I was very young, 5 or 6. So we did do a lot of kind of ballet within that. But in terms of taking actual class consistently, I didn't start doing that till I was 12, 13. And I just loved it. Yeah, I also grew up playing the piano. And so I've had a lot of music in my life, and dance is such a great way to combine music and movement, two of my favorite things. And so, like you said, La Bayadère was one of the pieces that we did in my dance school as a teenager, and it was my absolute favorite piece. I loved the costumes. I loved the feeling it gave me while we were all performing. And people may not know it on the surface unless they know the backstory about me and who I am, but there are little tidbits of my life woven throughout. I don't state them explicitly, but you saw that blog post I'd written on my website, and were able to kind of hone in on some of the things that have special meaning to me. I don't know if that answered your question. I hope it did.
Yeah, no, I think it did. Yeah, very well. I'm going to move on, kind of keeping the same theme, but moving on as well. I know you said that the circus travelling around during the war, it would have been difficult in reality, which makes total sense. But did anyone do anything similar? Was there circuses at that time? Did anyone move around? Any of that sort of thing?
Yeah, there were. So during my research, I did find out about a couple of circuses. Certainly circuses existed before. I mean, they've been around for a long time, right? Since Victorian times. And probably before that. Like, this is just the stuff that's been documented. But obviously during the Second World War, it became near impossible to easily move around anywhere, not just Europe. And so one interesting thing that I learned about while I was researching this was there was actually a circus where the owner had Jewish performers, and he hid their identities because he didn't want them to be taken away. And so that I found was really interesting. Now, my story is not based on that. It was just something that came up in research. And a lot of these circuses, there was a very famous one in France, the name is escaping me right now, but they were grounded. So they were sort of halted. I think probably during the early days of the war, before people really knew exactly how things would play out, there was a little bit of movement. But as things escalated, it was just sort of like, nope, stop. Nobody is doing anything. And then some of the performers as well, they joined the front lines and things. They joined the different movements and whatnot. Yeah, definitely took liberties with the whole fiction aspect of it in my novel, because it just would not have been possible, really.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the circus full of Jewish performers. Did they make it out of the war alive? Were they okay?
Pretty sure they did, actually. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think they did.
And it's always nice to hear those stories, obviously.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask this one. How long did you spend getting the balance right between the magic and the reality for it to work for you?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, I spent a long time writing the book, but that particular question around magic versus reality, that took a lot of editing and rewriting and massaging of words as well, because it's a tricky balance to get. It's not pure fantasy. I mean, it's rooted in reality, but then there are elements where you have to suspend your disbelief.
What happened in the first versions of your draft? I think you had the book set more in Thessaloniki.
I did, yes. So I had been learning about Greece's involvement in the Second World War. So let me just take you back a little bit, if that's okay. But what happened was I had the idea for a story featuring an illusionist and his daughter. So those characters had never changed. I really wanted to write a story about that. But in terms of the setting, I wasn't sure where I wanted to set it. And I was living in London at the time, and I got lost trying to find the Baker Street tube station. And I walked past a Greek cultural center near Marylebone High Street. And I went in to ask them for directions. And I saw a poster up for a lecture they were having on Greece's involvement in the Second World War the next week. And I love history. So I just thought, oh, I'm just going to attend this for fun. So I went back and I learned so much because growing up in Canada, we learned about these historical events from a Canadian, to some extent, a US and a British point of view. We didn't really get a lot of other countries' viewpoints, right? So I learned a lot and I thought, well, there's a lot of conflict here. And it's an area that I haven't really seen explored much in literature beyond Captain Corelli's Mandolin. So I just decided to make them live. Theo and Lena live in Thessaloniki. And the initial idea for the story was that they had all been sent back there because of the war, and Theo couldn't work. And so this actually probably would have been more appropriate for the time. But after 3-4 years of writing it, I had sent it to agents and, gotten a lot of feedback, a lot of it's almost there, but it's just not resonating with me, or like the stakes aren't high enough and whatnot. And so I just thought, okay, well, what would really ratchet up the tension in this book? And I was like, actually, instead of keeping them, I hesitate to use the word safe, because we know like even being stationarily safe in any place in Europe during the Second World War wouldn't have really been safe. But if they were traveling across Europe at the time, as things escalated and got worse and worse, that would actually create a lot of tension. And I thought, okay, I'm going to put them on a train and I'm going to just send them around Europe. And that was really where I think this story started. So about 4 years in is when I feel I really got the crux of the plot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I love the train idea, and that was what sold. I mean, obviously it's the title of the book, but that's definitely what sold it for me. I mean, when you were creating the train, and you've got all these different carriages, you walk us through it almost. Were there any specific influences for that aspect as such?
Yeah, I think a lot of that did actually come from, again, I hesitate to say my theater background because I never actually performed in plays or anything, but just that world of performance and costumes and set design as well. There were just so many things that I absorbed growing up that I wanted to create this very luxurious upscale world, right? Not like a traditional circus. And then I actually just really love traveling by train. It's probably my preferred method of travel. I get very car sick and I don't like flying. I do it, but I don't enjoy it. So going on trains just has like a very romantic feeling to me. And I've done a lot of train travel around Europe. And so I guess I kind of just took that and was like, well, what would this be like back in, a bygone era? I'm going to take the Eurostar, but, go back a few decades and add some gorgeous upholstery and amazing chandeliers.
So that is how they get across to England from France.
There's something called the night ferry, I believe. It's an international boat train from London, Victoria to Gare du Nord. And it would cross the English Channel on a train ferry. So it operated until the onset of the Second World War. And then it resumed again in 1947. So again, I took liberties with that because they wouldn't have been able to use it technically during the war. But it's fiction. It's not faction. That's what I tell people.
No, that's really interesting. That's something I remember reading Night Ferry, and I must have skipped exactly what it was.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Moving on to something a bit different. Lena being able to walk, as you do later on, it's kind of controversial without the extra context that you do give it. So I kind of want to ask you, why did you choose to go that route? Why does she become able to walk?
You are very right. It was a controversial decision to make. The reason I did it, and again, this sort of goes against some of the other decisions I made in the book, but I just don't think it would have been realistically possible for her to pursue what she ended up. I don't think it would have been possible if she had still been in a wheelchair. And again, it also, the other point that I want to make around that is that it wasn't uncommon for children with polio to later regain the ability to walk. And so my kind of, not frustration, but sort of what I say to people who say things like, well, she was fine being in a wheelchair. She didn't need to, learn how to do that to be a full person. I'm like, that's not what I was getting at all. What I was getting at is that actually, if you look at the facts and you look at the data, many, many, many children who had polio lost the ability to walk and later regained it through physiotherapy. It wasn't uncommon. And I think that that's probably what most people would want. Look, I have a brother with a disability. Okay. So I have seen firsthand what the world is like for those with disabilities. We're in 2023 right now. It's great that we're also empowered. It's wonderful that there's a lot more inclusion than there ever used to be. We're still a long way off of creating day-to-day cities and just people with disabilities being able to live the way those of us that are able-bodied can live. And that's a reality. And if people want to argue against that, that's fine. I'm not saying you can't live a full life. You absolutely can. But I find it very hard to believe that it is easier than it would be for someone who is able-bodied, right? So certainly at the time as well, now we go back many, 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 many decades, and the conversations and the attitudes towards people with disabilities were totally different. I don't even think disability was really a word. Crippled was used often, handicapped was used often, right? So I find it unfair when people say things like, well, she should have just stayed here. I'm like, she could have, that's fair. But I feel like I needed to do what was right for this character at the time. And that's why I made the choices that I made. And I think ultimately it was never about whether or not she could or could not walk. It was about her achieving other goals. And so that's really what I have to say about it. I don't know if I answered that properly.
You absolutely did. And I'm very glad I asked that question. Thank you. That was an amazing answer. You were saying it there, it was making me think. You've got this whole history in your acknowledgements of treatments that did work and did happen. Yeah. Are you able to talk more about that?
I absolutely can touch on it a little bit. So a lot of children who had polio, they used leg braces and things like this, or they used wheelchairs. But science and medicine, always evolving, right? Even now, people are always coming up with new ideas on how to better improve the lives of how we all live. And again, I say the word improve, knowing full well that there are many people with disabilities and medical issues that live very full lives. I'm not trying to say that they don't, right? But I'm saying that for children who may have had the ability to walk, or like Lena, because she got polio when she was such a little baby, maybe didn't even get the chance to try, that there were methods that people could try. So initially, actually, at the time, a lot of doctors thought that keeping kids with polio stationary was the helpful thing. So they'd either be in wheelchairs, or they were really bad cases. There were these things called iron lungs in hospitals. And it's basically this like machine that you lie in. And I mean, you can breathe and your head's exposed and everything, but you're stationary the entire time and there's no movement at all. But there was an Australian nurse that came up with this pioneering treatment for treating polio that involved movement and using rags that she would soak in like very hot water. And the idea was that if you take those and then you like wrap the limbs in them and you start introducing that kind of movement, that the body will respond and eventually regain, or eventually like have some kind of ability to, move your limbs. And so I believe her name was Elizabeth. I can't remember her last name now, but that was a treatment that she sort of brought over to England. And then it later became very popular in the United States before the vaccine, obviously. And that this all happened, like it was all true. It was something that people used and that helped children learn to walk again.
You read that and you think, rags with water and stuff, that just sounds kind of obvious. Of course, you've got to put the historical context in there, and they were thinking, oh no, these people have got disabilities, that's it. Yeah. The Theresienstadt Ghetto.
Yeah, Theresienstadt.
Theresienstadt Ghetto. I had never heard of it. Don't hear of certain things in the Second World War. As I think you said earlier, we were France and Germany and Britain over here. But I looked it up and they had performers and it was just a completely different thing to what you often hear.
Yep.
Can you tell us about it and also concentrate, I suppose, on the performers?
So it was a concentration camp, but and this is another thing that I try and remind people about when it's talked about in the context of the book, because some readers have reached out and said, well, you didn't call it this. And I'm like, yeah, but at the time, people didn't know what it was. They didn't know what they were going to. They didn't know it was going to be dangerous. So you can't call it a concentration camp at the time, right? So it was a place where Jews were sent, and it was kind of billed as this town. People said, oh, you're all going here, you're going to set up a town. They had their own, the Jews had their own self-government there. It basically functioned like a very normal town. They had a school, they had a library, they had a canteen. There was a football league as well. They had their own currency in there. And so obviously there were guards and things like that, right? It couldn't operate without that. and they were monitored. And if they wanted to like leave the fortress walls and like go out into, you know, the rest of like, it's not Czechoslovakia now, at the time it was something else, but that area, they could do that with supervision for at least for part of it. But basically, it was sort of like a place where a lot of intellectual and artistic Jewish people went. And so there were opera singers, there were poets, there were musicians, and it just became this cultural kind of place for them to live, to perform. Granted, they did perform for, you know, the SS or the guards, but also for their fellow prisoners / like residents, right? Now, unfortunately, we all know what it was now, but I think I like to hope that at least having some of the artistic activities there helped people cope with what they were going through, right? Because I'm sure living in those conditions, they knew things couldn't be great once they arrived. Yeah, it was like a total cultural place. And then actually, they ended up using it as like a, how do I say this? There were a group of Danish children who were sent to Theresienstadt, and I believe they perished, if I'm not mistaken. And so the King of Denmark said he wanted to pay a visit to this town because, again, nobody knew that they were doing anything wrong. And so the SS and the guards and everybody there said, okay, well, everybody's going to pretend like this is just a normal town. And so they, for weeks before, they had the residents beautifying the place with flowers and basically just like made to believe that it was functioning like a normal place. They even created a propaganda film around it, believe it or not. Eventually, obviously, everybody saw the light and prisoners that were still alive were liberated. Again, that whole place, I think, speaks to the idea of deception and illusion and, you know, saying one thing, but it actually being something else.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, with what you said at the start there, I do know that I caught myself effectively applying hindsight to Alexander when he's saying, I think he's saying like, oh, we don't know what's happening, or it seems okay. And you're there going, no, you know, this is awful. Get out, escape.
You're like, get out.
Yeah. And it is difficult sometimes, even when you know it yourself, to kind of apply that and say, okay, no, they did not know. We haven't talked so much about Horace, but yeah, he's the producer effectively of the circus, and he's kind of a good guy and a bad guy put together. More bad, definitely, by the end. But how should we feel about him by the end?
Ooh, that is a very hard question. I have a lot more empathy for Horace than I think most of my readers do. I think that's partly because I spent a lot of time crafting his character. I don't think he's an intentionally bad person. I think we get a little snippet of his childhood and how it has shaped him and why he's motivated to make the decisions that he does. There is one decision that happens that has severe repercussions. But again, I think if people, I hesitate to say it again because it's like, well, you knew kind of what you were doing, but also he didn't because he believed what, you know, an SS officer had told him. And I guess sort of didn't think that things would be as bad as they were. But he is kind of a selfish individual. Being selfish is not always a bad thing. I think it has a very negative connotation. But at the end of the day, aren't we all selfish? Aren't we all going to do what's best for us? And shouldn't we? I mean, if you can't take care of yourself, then that's not going to be very good for you, right? I don't think a lot of people have any empathy for him or like him. I think he's an absolute visionary, and I think he's misunderstood. I think that there are many people like him that exist in today's world that can just think beyond what, you know, an average person can think and can create beyond what the average person can create and can live this big life and yet ends up having everybody hate them because of it. And I think that's a mixture of jealousy. And I also think they don't understand it and they'll never get it. And so that's kind of what he deals with. Should we feel sorry for him by the end? Maybe yes and no. I think he got what he wanted. Maybe he realized way too late at the end that actually success and fame and finances and whatnot, it's not going to be there for you at the end of the day, right? But he also had a great ride. And Annie did something that, again, was still talked about in hushed tones and, well, not hushed tones, actually, people admired it. They loved it. And he will obviously not really live on because it's fiction, but he created something that really gave people a lot of joy and wonder.
I definitely struggled at first to form an opinion because I was thinking of Hugh Jackman and his role in The Greatest Showman and thinking, oh, yeah, that's okay.
No. Hugh Jackman's a lot better.
Yeah.
We like him a lot more.
Yes, yeah. But no, yeah, I did not know when the bit happens that you refer to, I was like, okay, that's quite different now. Obviously, he had his moments, definitely, if we call them moments. I mean, in context, he was an angel beforehand. I like him as a character very much. And I think I'm still deciding
how you feel.
Yeah, kind of quotes meant to be bad or good or, yeah, how he should be. But no, yeah.
I'm glad that you're deciding and not just a straight, the worst person ever. Because I think villains are the hardest people to write, right? Horace, yes, he is the antagonist / like one of the biggest villain of the book in some ways. But to me, they're the most interesting because as a writer, I'm like, well, what made you like that? What happened, right? And then when you hear about the backstory and you hear about childhood and things like that, that's when you sort of think, oh, okay, there's a lot more to them. I'm not justifying it and saying that makes their actions okay, because a lot of people had difficult childhoods and whatnot and didn't turn out like him or other villains. But, you can kind of understand why people do the things they do if you're willing to look beyond like the surface.
Definitely. I want to ask, I know, I think from my research that it's possibly not going to be your next book, very likely not going to, but I would like to ask about the thriller you wrote whilst you were submitting this Circus Train.
Yeah.
Is that something you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, do you just want to know a little bit more about it or how it came to be?
Yeah, because it just sounds so different, obviously, from the Circus Train. It makes you think, what could it be?
So I wrote that in 2019, I think before I'd gotten an agent. And I really didn't think I would get it. I didn't think Circus Train would sell. I had been working on it for almost 6 years at that point. I had queried so many agents. I had come so close. And I just said to myself, I'm done. This is the last time I'm sending it out. As soon as I had sent it out to the people that I needed to, I actually was done at that point. I remember sending a WhatsApp message to one of my friends who was in my writing course. Her name's Rachel. And I said, it's gone. I've thrown it off a cliff. I never want to see it again. It's finished. I'm excited about writing this thriller. It's totally different. It's going to be so good. And I needed to get away from doing historical fiction, right? Because I hadn't felt like I'd failed, but yeah, I had actually felt like I'd failed on some level because you learn a lot during that process and you learn what not to do the next time around. But I can't get those years back, right? I mean, on the one hand, in hindsight, I'm grateful for it, but also it's a lot of time to spend working on something. So I started work on a thriller. I really, again, didn't think anybody would bite. And I had an idea for a thriller that featured actually a ballet dancer, believe it or not, a former ballet dancer who ended up being a single parent. And basically what happens is one night her son goes missing, her baby son goes missing, her like 6-month-old son goes missing. And the only witness to the crime is her 5-year-old daughter. And so you've got this child who has a very overactive imagination, who's saying what she saw, and yet they can't figure out who did it. And so I wanted to explore the idea of the whole unreliable narrator. The main characters in that book, so one of them is, I would say, a British African woman. She's the one whose son goes missing. And then I've got an East Asian cop who comes to investigate, both female. And I also really wanted to write a thriller / crime novel with people of color because I like reading those books. So I wrote this in 2019 before there were like huge conversations around BIPOC and this and that, and publishing paid me. I don't know if you saw that, but there's this huge spreadsheet of people sharing what they were paid in book advances. And it's pretty stark, the contrast between how much Caucasian authors are paid and how much their BIPOC counterparts make. And so I just thought, well, I'm tired of reading only about one kind of person. I'm going to write my own. And so, yeah, that's what I did. And I did it in about a month, I think, 5 weeks. I just was like, heads down, I'm going to get this done because I don't have to think about the Circus Train anymore. And then I think a few days after I finished it and then I was excited to edit it, I got an offer of representation. And then I thought, okay, I guess I better go back to the circus train. And that's all I've really been able to think about since.
I mean, that novel, yeah, unreliable narrator came to you, as you said, that the 5-year-old. But that novel then kind of sounds like it's come straight from your heart.
Yeah, I mean, they both did, right? They're very different. I think a lot of writers do write in different genres, but I mean, I'm planning to submit that at some point, but it'll probably / definitely be under a different name because readers have this way of pigeonholing people, even publishers, right? It's like, oh no, now you do historical fiction with a little bit of magic, and that's what you do, and that's what we expect, right? So to then out of left field be like, guess what? I have this domestic thriller set in South London in 2019. Let's go. I don't know that anybody would bite, so I'm excited about it. I don't know when I'll be able to send it off, but it should be sometime this year, so yeah.
Well, I obviously can't publish it, but someone remind me to check out what the pseudonym is so I can find out what this novel is. And no, it sounds really good.
Will.
I mean, given all this then, what was your reaction when the Circus Train got you an agent? You know, you'd kind of said no to it and given up, but it must have still been thrilling.
Yeah, it was. I always tell my agent this story. I remember getting the email and I think tumbled out of the chair I was sitting in. I was at a coffee shop before work because I would often do that. I go into a coffee shop near work early so that I could do a bit of writing and feel like I'd done what I wanted to do for the day. And then I get on with my day. And I remember getting the email and just being completely stunned because I didn't think it would happen at that point. And then I also actually didn't even think it would sell, which sounds like I don't have faith in myself. But I think just because I'd experienced so many setbacks, I was like, it's okay. It's all right if it doesn't work. Because I felt I had another one, right? I was like, well, I'll just write another book. And I did. But then it ended up working out. And it's been a very slow but steady build, I would say. So it sold in Canada first, and then it sold a couple of weeks later in the UK. But then it didn't get picked up in the US for about a year. So I think there's this myth among authors and also among people who aren't in the publishing industry that there's overnight successes. And if it sells here, that means it's going to be published everywhere. And that's certainly not true. I mean, it can sell in one territory and then never find a home anywhere else. And that's fine, right? You've achieved your dream. But it's just been a slow build to what I think has been a very happy ending. And I'm looking forward to moving on. And I'm working on another historical fiction, by the way, but that will probably take me a little bit longer than a month. It's already taking me longer than a month to write. So not as fast as the thriller.
Well, we'll go straight on to that. What can you tell us about that at the moment?
Yeah, so that one is historical fiction with a little bit of magic and suspending disbelief. It's set between tail end of Belle Epoque Paris, so around 1910, 1911, and New York, actually modern day New York. So there is a dual timeline going on. And it's basically about this young noble woman in France who comes from, this very rich background. And she wants, her father was, I should say, because her father and mother died when she was very young and nobody ever found the killer. But he was a clockmaker. He was a neurologist. And so she wants to follow in his footsteps, but because of the time period and what women could or could not do, she's not allowed to. She's basically, her uncle, who's now her guardian, has said, you must marry the day you turn 21. And so that's what she thinks her future is going to be. And she's supposed to marry a New York financier. So that's kind of where New York comes into play. But yeah, the night before her wedding and her 21st birthday, she finds a magical pocket watch. And that's really all I can say. The next 24 hours are a whirlwind. And there's a little bit of romance and there's mystery because she's trying to find out the truth behind her parents' killer. And then everything is hopefully all wrapped up in a neat little bow by the end.
I like that. The pocket watch. Yep, I'm into this. I'm going to be watching out for
Okay,
it.
good.
Definitely. Yeah,
good.
Brilliant. So, I mean, Amita, it's been lovely having you on today and reading your book. Thank you very much for being here today and for all the information and the stuff that's just been great to listen to.
Oh, thank you so much, Charlie. It's been a pleasure to be here. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for listening. Please do share this episode with anyone you think would be interested in it. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 72, was recorded on the 26th of January and published on the 27th of February, 2023. Music and production by Charlie Place.